Greetings and welcome back to class. My name is Professor Grant, and today we are going to talk about don't hate the player, hate the game. I thought this was a really good, um, I thought this was a really good title for this topic. At first, I didn't quite understand it, and then as I started reading it, I realized what the author was discussing, and I thought it was really, really catchy, and I thought that it was really poignant for what we're going to talk about. Um, so if you go to the next slide, uh, tell me who this is, or think about, not tell me because we're not in person, but tell me who this is. Some of you may know this person, this picture. Some of you may be familiar with the name Breonna Taylor. Breonna Taylor was a young lady in Louisville, Kentucky. She was in the apartment, I think it was an apartment or a house with her boyfriend. I don't know if they were both sleeping. I think they were both sleeping or something in the bed. And there was a bang at the door, someone pounding on the door, and people rushed in. So as people were rushing in, her boyfriend didn't know who it was, and he got a gun. And if I'm not mistaken, he shot at the people before he knew who they were. But they were the Louisville police. And so they rushed into the door and they rushed into the place of residence and began shooting. And they shot this woman, Breonna Taylor, and she died. Right? They said they came in because they were told that drugs were being sold out of this place of residence. Well, come to find out, there were no drugs at the residence, and there was no reason for them to go in to where these people were sleeping. So um, it was an awful murder. An unarmed Black woman was murdered by the police, and it sparked a lot of controversy, and it sparked outrage by the Black community, by many members of the white community, by people all over the world. This happened in tandem with the murder of George Floyd by another police officer in Minnesota, and also the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. All this happened within months of each other. Ahmaud Arbery, um, by local residents of his neighborhood who was white. They felt that he was jogging in the neighborhood. They felt that he should not be jogging. They felt that he was trespassing or that he was not where he was supposed to be. They cornered him, tried to get away, and they shot and killed him. So all these things happened at the same time, right? But the two big ones that were had to do with police specifically were George Floyd, who was murdered by Minnesota police, and um, Breonna Taylor, who was murdered by um, Louisville police in Louisville, Kentucky. And so one of the points of the conversation was this question. Was the murder of this woman, the unfortunate and heinous murder of this woman, the cause of a few bad apples, a few bad police officers, or is this a larger problem? Is it the problem of a few bad players, or is the game rigged? Is it a problem with a few bad police officers who made a poor decision and should be punished? Or is the problem of policing in America altogether? Some people believe, many people believe that what happened should not have happened. Liberals, conservatives, Black, white, it doesn't matter. Many people believe this woman should not have been murdered. She should still be alive. Most people will say it's unfortunate. The difference is some people say we should punish those police officers so that it doesn't happen again. We get the bad police officers, the police officers that aren't doing their job, they're not following protocol. Those police officers, they should be punished. They should be put in jail or taken off the force, have their badges taken away, etc. That'll fix the problem. And then there's another part of the conversation that says no, because if you take away a few, another few are just going to go in their place. It's not the problem of just a few bad apples. It's not the problem of just a few bad police officers. There's a problem with the system of policing in general, which is why it keeps happening. Doesn't matter if it's Louisville, Kentucky. Doesn't matter if it's Minnesota. It doesn't matter if it's New York. It doesn't matter if it's Georgia. It doesn't matter if it's Florida or Texas. It's happening so much, not because of a few bad police officers, but because of a system of poor policing and racialized policing and racism in our criminal justice system as a whole. And so that is what we're going to talk about today. Not just the players in the game, but the game as a whole. Don't hate the player, hate the game. So when we think about, as sociologists, parts of inequality, one of the things that sociologists look at is not just what happens with individual people, but what happens with people as a whole. We don't just look at people's individual experiences. That's oftentimes what sociologists may look like. I'm not sociologists, psychologists may look at. And then also anthropologists to some degree. Look at the human experience of people. However, sociologists look at people as groups, people in groups. And all of us are a part of a group. We're a part of a gendered group. If we identify with a gendered identity, we are part of a class group. We are part of a racial group. We are part of if we're part of a religious group or a non-religious group. We're a part of a regional group, depending on what region of the United States you were born in. We are part of an ethnicity. We are part of something, of some major group. And so sociologists look at those groups and look at how groups are treated and why. And with that being said, sociologists many of them, tend to look at things on a macro level. Meaning we don't, in a situation like Breonna Taylor, we don't just look at the bad actions of a few people who do bad things. We know that sometimes bad people do bad things, or people just do bad things, and people do good things. So we know that that does happen. But we also understand that oftentimes bad people who are doing bad things is an extension of something else bad, is an extension of a bigger, badder problem, which we want to get to the root of. And that is why sociologists tend to do macro level studies. We believe that oftentimes there is a system of inequality that allows for bad people to do bad things and for people to be victims of those bad things, of those bad actions. And that system fails to uphold its promise of democracy for all people. And part of the way that this is done is by allowing for people to do bad things and allowing that to happen. And so that's what we look at in the macro level studies. Also in macro level studies, we look at what's called institutional discrimination. And so when we're looking at institutional discrimination, we are not just suggesting that discrimination happens just between people. Yes, there are people who won't like other people. simply because of what they look like, or who they are, or how they identify, or what group they align with. We know that. And honestly, there's nothing we can do about how one person feels or how individuals feel. You can't do much. That person has to decide to change their minds on their own. So we can't do much about how individuals feel about another person. But when individual acts of repetitive discrimination have a pattern that is embedded and that is placed in and that becomes foundational for a social structure and a social system, then that is what we call institutional discrimination. And discrimination can happen in many forms. You can have institutional racism. You can have institutional sexism. You can have institutional homophobia. You can have institutional classism. You can have institutional ethnocentricity. Many, many, many different forms of institutional discrimination. But it is when people are allowed to perpetuate bad behaviors and allow those bad behaviors, actions, thoughts, and results to become a part of a structure. And now the way that system is structured is on a discriminatory level. So if you have, for example, using police as an example, if you have a few police officers that are allowed to do bad things, mistreat certain people, mistreat people of color, over police certain neighborhoods, harass, be physically violent towards Black people, people of color, whoever. And then those people then are able to reach levels of lieutenant and captain and sheriff and chief of police. With those same mentalities, they're able to take those ideas, those mentalities, those actions, those practices, and they're able to now spread it across the system of policing in that area. Or maybe in multiple areas if one gets a job at another police station. That's actually how the system of policing in Los Angeles became so negative. If you read Spatializing Blackness, he talks about how when many African Americans started to move out west to escape the racism of the South, the police in Los Angeles, in these predominantly white areas, now having Black people with money move to these areas in Los Angeles, they wanted to find ways to keep them under control. So they began to recruit white police officers from the South because the South was known for being able to control the Blacks. And obviously they did this through violence. They did this through intimidation. They did this through racism. And so they began to bring those police officers out to Los Angeles and recruit them. And in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, the Los Angeles Police Department became one of the most corrupt, one of the most notoriously violent, one of the most heinous police departments in the country. They were known for beating up Black people, Black men specifically. They were known for being corrupt. They were known for doing bad things. Again, just bringing in a few changed the whole system of policing in that city and really along the West Coast for decades. Okay? So again, talking about institutional discrimination, and again, not just happening with racism, but on many different fronts. Institutional sexism says, yes, women shouldn't make as much as men. But then those people have the ideas and can put it into practice to then say, I'm going to pass policies and laws that make it difficult for women to make as much as men. right? And so what we're going to do with the rest of this time is we're going to talk about the various examples of ways that not only certain people practice discrimination, but how discrimination is evident in the larger society. So then when you go to your friends or your family or your, somebody who you may be having a disagreement with about this topic, you can say, hey, we're not just talking about a few bad apples. We're talking about real life institutional barriers that are outside of just a few people. And here are the examples that I'm going to give you, and you can give them these examples that I'm giving you. One of the ways in which we see institutional discrimination and how discrimination is not just a few bad apples, but a system of oppression is through housing, right? One of the key means of creating wealth and passing down wealth to the next generation, many people know, for most common people, right? Not your billionaires or, multiple millionaires, even though they use this method as well. But most people, when they have money or they have capital, what is the first thing they're going to do? They're going to purchase a home. They're going to buy a house. They're going to buy real estate. They're going to buy land. Because houses, homes, land, that is one thing that always appreciates most of the time. Most houses are going to appreciate over time. Land and land use is going to appreciate over time. So when you have money, most people invest it into housing, right? Housing, stocks, businesses, all those types of things. But definitely housing. And so where you live, where you're allowed to live, and where you live has a direct effect on the type of life that you can set up for your child in the future, your child or your children in the future, right? And so that housing and where a person lives should be available to any person if you can afford to live there. If you can afford a house, you should be able to move into that house. If you cannot, then you may not. And so oftentimes when people move into a neighborhood, they want their neighborhood to look a certain way. Also, within the Americanized society and within US history, with race playing a central role in capitalism and race playing a central role in where people live, where people invest, and where businesses grow and how neighborhoods mature, if people or if too many of people of a certain racial group live in a neighborhood, oftentimes developers may not want to move there or people may not want to invest in that area, right? And so that can then have a direct effect on class and capital, right? So there was a time in our history, and not even just historically, it was very prevalent historically, and it is still prevalent in some ways today. This notion of redlining. And what redlining was, it was in the 20s and 30s and 40s, where banks and realtors and real estate agents would draw a red line around certain areas of a city. And along those red lines, they were not allowed to, to give loans to African Americans, Black people, who wanted to live inside or maybe outside, depending on how the line was drawn, certain places. So if a Black person was a professional, had enough money, hit the lotto, whatever, and they wanted to move into a neighborhood, they were not allowed. And realtors or bankers would say, you cannot get this loan if you want to live here. You're not we can't take your money if you want to live here, right? And they would purposely set up a system to keep Black people living in some neighborhoods and to keep white people living in other neighborhoods, with the neighborhoods that white people were living in, houses appreciating at a much higher value than Black people. This became illegal in the 1970s, I believe, around the 1970s and 80s for sure. It became illegal, especially after the Fair Housing Act. Weren't allowed to do that, right? But even in the 90s and in the 2000s, there is still evidence of realtors, of real estate brokers, people purposely not showing houses or not uh, um, steering people of color, families of color, away from certain areas, steering them away from certain areas so that housing and neighborhoods can continue to be segregated along racial lines. So again, this notion of redlining was not just a few bad apples. It wasn't just a few realtors or a few bank owners. This was a nationwide thing where a policy, a national policy, had to be passed in order to do away with it. This same notion was also a part of what is called restrictive covenants, where certain grantees and grantors of real estate were allowed contracts or given contracts, but only if they kept certain groups or restricted certain groups from living in certain neighborhoods, right? So these restrictive covenants wasn't as legal as redlining, but it was still part of a well-known, well-organized tradition of working, tradition of real estate where certain people were allowed certain contracts only if they kept certain neighborhoods all black, all white, or predominantly minority, predominantly majority. Okay. Um, but it wasn't just directly in housing as well, but also through the military. So even the system of through the military also helped to create institutional discrimination in housing. For example, when particularly our soldiers, U.S. soldiers, came back from the war, World War II, many of them were given um, as a subsidy what was known as the GI Bill. And the GI Bill was given to soldiers, veterans, as compensation for the work that they had done to help maintain democracy in the world and to help maintain democracy in the United States, right? And so this GI Bill was a subsidy for veterans to, when they came back to the States, to get housing. They had housing vouchers. They got college tuition paid. They got loans for businesses. They got a lot of subsidies from the government to help them in their wealth building process. Well, this was in the 1940s and 50s. And so the white soldiers that came back, many of them, first thing they did was they left the cities and they brought houses with these vouchers. No money down, no money in the bank. They had beautiful homes in the suburban areas. Many of them who graduated high school, the government paid for them to go to college. They got college degrees in the 40s and 50s, and they got really good paying jobs after that, along with military benefits. Or they started their own businesses. And even today, there are a lot of white people, maybe even some white people in this class. If you were to talk to your grandfathers or your fathers or your mothers or grandmothers, they might tell you, oh, yes, your grandfather was in the war. And if you ask him what happened after he got back, and he said he went off to college, ask him how he paid for it. He say, oh, yeah, we bought a house right after that. Ask him, how did y'all pay for that? He'll probably say the GI Bill. They'll probably say the GI Bill. But because this was in the 1940s and 50s, racism was still the order of the day, meaning the white soldiers who came back were able to get loans, get houses, go to college, all for free. The black soldiers who came back were not allowed to access the GI Bill, which means a white person's grandfather was able to get a house. The house may still be in the family today, and worth quadruple what he paid for it. So again, wealth being passed down, or he was able to go to college, get a degree, have a really, really good paying job, set his son up so that his son didn't have to go to college. He had a really good paying job, which means now you may be able to go to college and get a really good paying job. You see how that wealth happens just by that one act? If everybody does their part, you can pass down a life of ease for an entire generation. But just like you can pass down a life of ease, you can also pass down a life of hardship, because those black soldiers who came back could not access the GI Bill because of racism, which means they had to go back to their menial jobs. They had to go back to only having a high school education. They had to go back to living in the inner city, some of them living in the projects. My grandfather being one of them. He went off to the Korean War, could not get the access. He could not access the GI Bill because of the color of his skin. So he continued to live in the projects until the church, the black church, created a way for him to move his family out of the projects and into a home. But because he was black, he could not access the GI Bill. If he could, maybe my family would be in a different situation. So again, we're talking about institutional discrimination. Policies that are passed, widespread policies, widespread things that are happening that don't just affect one or two or three people, not just a few bad apples, not just a few people saying no, millions of people who got an extra leg up, extra house, college degrees, businesses started, and millions of people that could not. It's not just a few bad apples, that's institutional discrimination. Urban renewal, eminent domain. Urban renewal, often called gentrification, where when you see that a place is decaying, an area of a city is decaying, and then there is a big project movement in that area. What happened to those people? They end up being forced out, oftentimes through eminent domain. There are laws to protect people so that they do not have to leave where their place of residence. So then the country passed a law called eminent domain, which allows for people to just come in and make you move even if you do not want to move. We see why there are so many highways. 95, 75, 285, 295, 10, 20, all these different highways. Where do they come from? And what areas do they cut through? Most of them cut through the inner city. And at that time, the city was made up of black people. So when you see these big highways, all of your biggest highway projects that connect us cities all throughout the country, was done as a means of urban renewal that negatively affected the housing of African Americans. Not just a few bad apples, not just a few bad players, a game that is rigged. Even when we look at environmental discrimination, even when we look at why certain areas have the worst air, have the worst water, Flint, Michigan, etc. Many of these places are people who are predominantly minority. Not just a few bad apples, but a game that is rigged. Now let's look at racism and the criminal justice system, right? When we look at race and crime, right? When we look at what we were just talking about with Breonna Taylor, not just a few bad apples, though it is important for those police officers who are wrong, who do wrong, that they are punished. That they are punished to the fullest extent of the law. And for those police officers that do want to do right and are just, they should be promoted and they should be the ones that are leading. Sad part is we don't know who's who. It's hard to tell. And there are a lot of bad people who are in these positions who don't care. And the good people know who they are, but because of the bond, the blue shield of silence, the loyalty that many people have for their group, they don't say anything. In the same way where you have a gang and that gang won't snitch on each other, That crew won't snitch on each other. You talk about Bloods, Crips, they have a gang, they have loyalty. It's the same way. In the military, those soldiers have a loyalty and a bond where they won't tell on each other. That same thing exists in the police force. Even if there's some that says, man, this is wrong, we shouldn't be doing this. They may not say anything though. They may wish that their partner didn't do certain things, but they're not going to say anything. Many of them don't, most don't. Which is why we say it's not just a few bad apples. It is a system of silence, a system of looking the other way, and a system of racial oppression. And we say it's a system because the foundation of it is wrong. Actually, the foundation of law enforcement in the United States started with the Black Codes. The Black Codes were a list of laws, of things that Black people, they were freedmen at the time, could and could not do. Before they were called slave codes. So so-called slaves were not allowed to congregate together. They were not allowed to be out by a certain time. They had to have certain papers on them. If you were free, you had to have your freedom papers on you at all times. These were slave codes. When slavery was abolished, or at least chattel slavery was abolished, only unless you were the perpetrator of a crime, then they were called Black codes. Black codes were created in a like manner. If you see freedmen or you see Black people, more than a few congregating, you can break them up. They can be arrested. They can't be out by a certain time. You know, all of these codes and rules. And if they broke these rules, if one looks you in the eye, they could be arrested. They could be arrested and put in jail. They could be arrested and fined. Sometimes they were lucky if they got put in jail. Because if the Klan, or if the red shirts, or if any other white vigilante group got a hold to them, they could possibly be lynched. Okay? Citizens Council. So these were called the Black Codes. And this was the foundation of law enforcement and policing in America. If you look at where policing started, the first precinct, it started in Boston. And those police officers were made up of these so-called slave catchers from the South. So actually slave catchers in the South, people who were paid to go out on the road and find runaway enslaved Africans and bring them back to the plantations. That is the foundation in some of your first police officers. Again, not a few bad apples, you're talking about a system. And so in that system, in that foundation was built upon hurting, capturing, and arresting and confining Black people. Okay? So this is why we say it is a system. As we move forward, and from the latter part of the 19th into the 20th century, there became this longing from U.S. citizens to expand the country. When there was a need for the building of roads, the paving of roads, the building and the connecting of highways, they had to pay people to do that. And guess who they paid? Or actually, guess what they did? They created something called a convict leasing system, where convicts, people who were in jail, majority Black, were now forced to work the land. They were forced to build roads. They were forced to build highways. So if you see shows, movies like Life, or if you see shows where you see people in striped outfits and they are hitting the ditch, they're not just making that up. That was a convict leasing system. Certain precincts would lease out convicts and get money for it. They would lease out convicts. They had to go to certain areas, build buildings, build stadiums, build highways, build roads, build cities, and then come back. And they did it for no money. It was like a form of slavery. But because they were imprisoned, that's what they had to do. Ask me, what were they in prison for, Dr. Grant? Not paying taxes. for years. They might be in prison for not paying taxes. They might be in prison for looking a white person in the eye. They may be in prison for staying out too late. They may be in prison because they didn't have their ID on them and a white person asked them for their ID. They may be in prison because they were hungry and they took a sandwich from the store. These were reasons why many of these black people were called convicts were put into this system, put in jail for years and years and years at a time, and then leased out to build the nation. Not a few bad apples. We're talking about a system of institutional discrimination, right? Also, if we look at moving on towards the modern times, particularly in the 80s and 90s, when people started doing drugs, heavy. You've seen the documentaries, you've seen the shows, you've heard the music. Around the 1970s and 80s, drugs came into the picture, boy, people was partying. Especially in Hollywood, especially in the upper class, Hollywood, Wall Street, celebrities, right? And what were they using? Cocaine. That was the drug of the day. Sniffing cocaine, right? Musicians, everybody, all in the clubs, right? Maybe your parents or grandparents who lived during those times saw movies about it, right? Maybe they saw movies about it. Maybe they heard about it from friends. But it was a time. But in the time, cocaine was big, but it was expensive. So you had to have enough money to snort a lot of cocaine. But there was also, in the 1980s, a drug called crack, which was a more watered down and cheaper version of cocaine, but can get you high just as quick. That was cheap. So crack was a drug that was used among the more poor and working class people. And cocaine, pure cocaine, was used among people who had money. Now, both are the same drug. You use cocaine to make both, right? But if a person got pulled over with powdered cocaine, they will get less time than if a person got pulled over with crack. But there's no difference between the two. They both get you high, they both will kill you. So why is it that if they're the same drug, one will get you twice as much time or almost twice as much time as the other drug? Why? Because one drug was associated with rich white people and one drug was associated with poor black people. It's as simple as that. We're not talking about a few bad players. We're talking about a system. And there was an entire set of laws put in place across the country, not just a few bad judges, across the country that said if you are caught with crack, you get X amount of years. And if you are caught with same amount, 15 grams, 15 grams, 1 pound, 1 pound, 3 pounds, 3 pounds. Same amount of cocaine, you will have less this amount of years. And the amount of years you have for crack, which was associated with black people, poor people, violence, was more than the amount of time you would get if you had cocaine, which was associated with rich people, white people, partying, having fun. Same drug. Not a few bad apples. We're talking about a system. Also, when we talk about race and crime, racial profiling, we all know it exists. This is where it gets personal for me. I can give you so many examples. I've been pulled over. I've been pulled, especially in Florida and Georgia, for sure. Told to get out of the car, accused of drug trafficking, had dogs put on me, put in jail. No crime, nothing found. But then many of my white friends did not have those same experiences. Some people may say, well, Professor Grant, I mean, maybe you just had a bad police encounter. It's really hard to say when many of my black male friends can say the same thing, and many of my white male friends will also say, nah, that never happened to us. There's a documentary that I show some of my classes called Hello Privilege is me Chelsea. And there's a man on there who talks about the complexion for the connection. There's a lot of research, there's a lot of personal accounts that will tell you that police officers, most police officers, will treat you differently based on your race, especially if you're male. There's very few people that will deny that that occurs, even police officers, which is why there's so much implicit bias training that they're required to do because so many of them have so much bias against Black people and towards white people. At this point, it's just kind of hard to deny it. So racial profiling absolutely exists. Stop and frisk, driving while Black. Stop and frisk is now illegal in New York, but at the time, stop and frisk was legal in the 90s and in the 2000s. Stop and frisk basically allowed for police officers to say if they feel like someone, if a person looks to be suspicious or looks like a drug dealer, or they suspect that something is wrong, they can legally stop that person and frisk them. They can stop them, put them against the wall, and check to see if they have anything on them. A majority of the time, they were wrong. But if you're checking everybody, at some point, you're bound to get a few. And in those few, they would say, see, and this is why. When you check 1,000 people, 955 didn't have anything on them. The 45 did. And you use the 45 to say, this is why we had to check them. It's now illegal because a young man by the name of, what's his name? Man, what's that kid's name? It was a kid. He was a young adult. I'm trying to, let me put in stop and frisk. In New York. I can't remember, but it is now considered unconstitutional. Let's see. Black male. Cannot remember his name, and it's not coming up right away. But there was a young Black male who was a victim of stop and frisk. He was put in jail. He was put in jail for something he did not do. He could not afford to go to court and get a lawyer, so he stayed in a maximum security prison. He stayed in Rikers Island because they said he stole a book bag, put in Rikers, and the boy was beaten senselessly for 2 years and placed in solitary confinement. When he finally got out, finally they just let him out. He didn't even have a court date. They just let him out. He was traumatized, this little boy. You can Google this. Traumatized. But he got out, happy to be home. When he finally got home, he went back to school, got his GED, and he was going to college. But as he was walking down the street, cops were watching him. And I think he jaywalked or something. I can't remember what he did. But it wasn't a real crime. It was like jaywalking. It was something that innocent. And he was away, and the police pulled up to his mom's house and said they were looking for him. And he got re-traumatized because he didn't want to go back to jail. And he was so nervous and he was so scared of going back to jail. He was so upset because of what they did to him. The officers, the inmates, that when he found out that the police were looking for him, he killed himself. He killed himself. There's a documentary about it. Brought tears to my eye. And after that, New York passed a law that made stop and frisk illegal. But unfortunately, for 2 decades, thousands and millions of people were subject to racial profiling. We're not talking about a few bad apples. We're talking about a system of institutional discrimination. Lastly, voting laws and disenfranchisement. As we know, for decades and decades, people were not allowed to vote. Black people weren't allowed to vote. Immigrants weren't allowed to vote. Women weren't allowed to vote. But over time, certain groups got the right to vote. The last group were Black women, right? But even now, there are laws that make it difficult for people who were formerly convicted or formerly incarcerated to vote. There are certain laws that don't allow, that make it very difficult for a person to vote. There are laws that won't allow you to vote online because it's easier. And it may allow for more people to be able to vote. So there are a lot of restrictions. There are a lot of redistricting and disenfranchisement that happens when it comes to voting that make it difficult for people to be able to participate in the political process. Why? Because if everybody can have the right to vote their interests, guess what? Laws will be passed that will benefit you. And people in power don't want that. Laws will be passed that will make it equal for men and women to get the same pay, for men and women to be treated fairly, for women to be able to make decisions about themselves in the same way that men do, for Black people to be able to live in the same areas as white people, for people of color to have the same opportunities that white people have, for people to be able to love who they want to love, or be with who they want to be with, or marry who they want to marry, and live the way they want to live. These things will be able to happen if all people, had the right to vote their interests and then see what the country says. But in order to minimize that, we say, well, we didn't get enough votes. Well, why didn't we get enough votes? Because certain people could not vote or weren't allowed to vote or could not get to the voting ballot or there was not enough out. There's so many barriers in the voting process. You see that there are more barriers in certain neighborhoods, in certain areas than there are in others because they want certain people to vote and want to make it difficult for other people to vote. So voting laws and disenfranchisement also play a role in institutional discrimination. So what are some solutions? Number one solution, understanding our privilege. All of us sit into some degree in a form of privilege, whether it be male privilege, race privilege, class privilege, gender privilege, sexual identity privilege. We all sit at some intersection of privilege. Use your privilege to make things better for those who are not privileged in that position. White people, use your privilege to make things better for people of color. Men, use your privilege to help make things better for women. Straight people, use your privilege to help make lives better for queer people. If you have money, if you're middle class or upper middle class, use your privilege to help create opportunities and jobs and availabilities for people who are working class or poor. Use your privilege to help others, right? And also, book Racism Without Racists. It's a really good book that talks about colorblind racism in the 21st century. It talks about ways in which racism still exists in our society, but also ways in which we can combat it, right? So there are solutions to these problems. We just have to work towards finding those solutions. And not only finding them, but implementing them and implementing them consistently until change does not only happen with a few good people, but change happens with the entire gang and the entire system. Hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Hope you've enjoyed this information. Look forward to your feedback. Hope you have a great day, great week, great weekend. See you soon.